I'm honored to introduce our esteemed panelists and get the discussion underway. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Mary Kissel. Mary is a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and she is a Fox News contributor and weekly co-host of The John Batchelor Show, a nationally syndicated radio talk show. She is a graduate of Harvard College and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I did cut a lot.
I asked her to keep it short.
Yes. We're so glad to have you here, Mary, and thank you for participating tonight. I'm also really excited to introduce Claudia Rosette, who I'm very proud to say is a foreign policy fellow at Independent Women's Forum. We are so happy to have her as part of our team. She is an award-winning journalist who has reported over the past 3 decades from Asia, the former Soviet Union, Latin America, and the Middle East. She worked from 1984 to 2002 on the staff of the Wall Street Journal, including stints as editorial page editor of its Asian edition, based in Hong Kong, and bureau chief in Moscow. Claudia is widely credited with groundbreaking reporting on the United Nations and its dealings with despotic regimes. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Kyron Skinner. She is a W. Glenn Campbell Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Also, at Carnegie Mellon University, she is a long list, impressive, founding director of the Center for International Relations and Politics, founding director of the Institute for Strategic Analysis, faculty director of the CMU Washington Semester Program, and director of the Institute for Politics and Strategy. She has courtesy appointments in research centers and departments in the College of Engineering, School of Computer Science, and Heinz College, the university's School of Public Policy. Professor Skinner has served on numerous Defense Department and White House boards. Most recently, she was appointed to the U.S. Defense Department Defense Policy Board. So thank you again to everyone for joining us this evening for what I know will be an enlightening discussion, and we'll have time for some questions and answers at the end as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mary to start the discussion.
Great, thanks very much. Hello, everybody. Welcome. So glad that you could join us tonight. Before we start, I just wanted to thank the Hoover Institution, the Independent Women's Forum, Free to Choose Media for organizing this event. I think you'll agree that you don't have a lot of media these days in print or in video that adds to the sum of human knowledge and accrues in a positive way to human civilization. So please let's give a round of applause to our filmmakers for making this absolutely terrific contribution, and I would encourage every single one of you to watch the full length of the film. It's absolutely worth it. And can everybody hear us in the back? Great. Well, this is a timely discussion because, as you know, we live in a very disordered world. In fact, we probably face more threats today than at any other time since World War II, and we face a great variety of threats. We face threats from established powers, Russia, China. We face threats from small powers that have access to big weapons, North Korea, Iran, even a place like Syria. We face threats from terror organizations that occupy a larger geography than even a few years ago. Terrorism is no longer an issue simply in the Middle East. It's stretching into South Asia, the southern Philippines, throughout Africa. We've had several terror attacks, of course, here at home that you're all familiar with. And so the discussion of deterrence versus appeasement is a very timely discussion for us to have. And of course, we make the same mistakes over and over again. And as I opened up my New York Times today, which is always a convenient place to find the same mistakes over and over again, I saw Nick Kristof's column, which was titled, "Trump's Talk Worries Me Like the Talk Before the Iraq War," referring to the Korean Peninsula. So it's a timely discussion, and I propose to break it into roughly 3 parts. We're going to talk about the state of deterrence today. What is U.S. deterrence? What could it be? What should it be? The politics of deterrence, and then we'll have time for some case studies in talking about some of these specific examples. So that's it for me. Then we'll have Q&A, and you can ask far better questions than I will. So let's start with the big question. Claudia, I'll start with you. You're just to my left. We wouldn't have made this film
Yeah.
If there weren't questions about the state of U.S. deterrence today, what happened after the fall of the Cold War?
We stopped deterring, Mary. I mean, what happened was the peace dividend, the great relaxation, the assumption that history was over, that we could all relax. I was working in Russia just after the Soviet collapse, and we were scrambling to try and help them feel good about themselves. We didn't actually scramble to say we decisively won the Cold War, because we don't actually win wars anymore. That's maybe something we can get into. Not since World War II have we actually won a war. We end them, which is different. But we stopped being on our guard. It's the old story. We thought, well, things are really okay. And since then, it's been sort of a lurch after September 11th. President Bush then said, okay, this has gone too far. We need to do something. He went into Afghanistan. He went into Iraq. Then in his second term, he said, well, we sort of want to be nice members of the international community, and maybe we're doing a little too much. Let's back off, apart from the surge in Iraq, and began negotiating with North Korea, as had Bill Clinton, which was a disaster. And then followed President Obama, and appeasement became the theme of the day in every direction. It was an extended hand to the mullahs in Iran. It was the reset with Russia. It was deference to China over everything from climate change, the Paris Climate Treaty, to the pivot that never took place. It was one thing I think I should pass this along but basically, we stopped deterring, and the result was the rise. Okay, I'm just going to give you sort of a big picture thing here, and then was the rise of a network of countries, none of which could individually threaten us existentially, as President Obama kept saying, but put them together, and we're now looking at a rising network. The four prominent countries there are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, armed with nuclear weapons, I think both working with each other, cooperating with each other on many fronts, and learning from each other. When President Putin gave his March 1st speech to his parliament this spring, bragging about invincible missiles, the new nuclear triad, whether he has it or not, I don't know, maybe, but he showed something really jumped out at me. He had this animated video that showed one of his new invincible missiles circling the globe and striking the United States. Well, that's very North Korean. That's what Kim Jong-un does. And I thought, wow, this is, they learn from each other. That's a very simple example, but they see what they can get away with. And it's now okay for the head of state in dictatorships with nuclear weapons to show in their public speeches videos of missiles hitting the United States. That's apparently the new thing. So that's kind of where we are. And then under President Trump, I think my sense is he's still trying to figure out what to do, because the problems are so prolific. And he's done a few things that have been, I think, quite good. Last year, sending Tomahawk missiles into Syria for the first time, and then serving the president of China, Xi Jinping, a piece of chocolate cake during a visit to the United States, and informing him over this luscious piece of chocolate cake that we just sent Tomahawk missiles into Syria. He dropped a MOAB, a massive ordnance airburst, on Afghanistan, which says we're willing to use weapons we have not used before. And I think I should give others a chance to talk.
You've given us a trend line.
Yeah.
But Kyron, can you give us a concrete sense of where we were militarily at the end of the Cold War versus where we are today? Whether it's in number of missiles or the size of our Navy. I mean, how big has the deterioration really been?
I think before I answer that question, I just want to speak to something about the problem of deterrence. And I think, now it's on. I think one of the key issues is that we don't know what deterrence is anymore. That it's not
just a military?
And it's not. And I think the definition of deterrence is not even commonly agreed upon. And the reason I say that is that as the Cold War was ending, I think we do practice some deterrence. I don't think we'd be around if we didn't do any. But as the Cold War was ending, it coincided with some bigger cultural changes in the United States and in the West, including the decision at most universities and colleges to close down military history programs, U.S. history programs, the study of basic economics, and national security more broadly suffered. Meanwhile, the regional study programs in Middle East and Latin America had all gone far to the left, and instead of studying kind of hardcore military deterrence around the Middle East, we were studying things like basket weaving in the Lahore Valley. And I think that set of cultural factors in the academy made it impossible to really defend the West in the United States through deterrence, because those going into government didn't know exactly what it was. By age 25, people are actually writing legislation on Capitol Hill. They're the only ones who can take the indignity of low wages and group housing to get the work done and the long hours. And they often are writing, doing hard work for the members. But if they haven't learned what I've just talked about, or what we were studying in the 50s and the 60s, I think by the end of the 80s it was over. It's hard for them to make big decisions to defend the West, or those in the military. I think that the military academies may be one of the last places where you have kind of robust training in in military strategy and ideas.
So Claudia, are these two things coincident? Because
Yes.
you have Francis
Yes.
Fukuyama writing about the end of history at the same time that the universities were saying we don't need to worry about, as Kyron points out,
Absolutely.
hard deterrence and being prepared to take on our adversaries.
Yeah, that's one of the scariest statements I've heard.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, because you can go do basket weaving. Because, again, going back to Russia, look, in World War II, the U.S. made it very clear where it was victorious and what was going to be done about it. And Japan and Germany are democratic allies of America today. In Russia, there was a great scramble to try and paper over the horrible things that had been done, not just to the former Soviet Union, but to the satellite countries, to half the planet, really, as they were ushered by President Clinton into the G7, which became the G8, into the Paris Club of Creditors, which is creditor nations by fiddling the exchange, the old ruble rate. But all these things were forgotten. And if part of the problem is the universities as well, you're right. But it makes sense when you listen to how people discuss a lot of these issues today. You're exactly right. And can I add, there's something else. I'm going to leave town tomorrow, so I can say this safely, I think. And that is, in Washington, entire industries have developed, which are all about discussing the threats that we face, but not about actually addressing or solving them. And one of the things that jumps out at me from what you're saying, and which is sort of taboo to even discuss, but we have a tremendous nuclear force, degraded though it is, and actually I would love to hear more about just how bad it is. But I don't think our enemies believe anymore that we would use it. We became so intent remember in the 90s, and then even after the attacks on September 11th, everyone was discussing, they don't do it anymore, but how the US was the lone superpower. And, you know, the unipolar world and et cetera. And that's sort of gone away because there is this rising set of other countries, not as powerful as America, but more and more threatening. I mean, Russia, in a way, it wasn't 20 years ago. China, the same thing. North Korea, and the Iranians, and their sidekicks. But on nuclear, just to try and get to the undefined problem of deterrence, and look, I belong to, I'm a journalist. I'm invited to speak about these things, and I'm quite grateful for it, but I have no scholarly training in this either. So you're raising a really important issue. What is this, and who really is studying this?
How bad is it, Kyra?
I think it's getting better, but it has been fairly profound in the 21st century. That programs have been, you can count them literally on a hand or two. And I think that's a big factor in where we are. And you asked this broader question about timelines. And the fact that we have a Navy smaller than anything since middle of the 20th century, even before, I think speaks volumes to our readiness and the fact that we have to really think about what it means to have an all-volunteer military force. I think we have a strong force partly because of that, but since the early 70s when we switched to an all-voluntary force, we have an American public that is more disconnected to the military, which I think is part of the timeline of readiness as well. So if you go on university campuses or major liberal arts colleges, very few people will know anyone intimately who's serving in our wars. And it's for that reason that I've been so supportive of having military fellows on campus, and the Hoover Institution has done put a lot of effort into having military fellows. We have one from the Coast Guard here today who's out from Stanford, so that students meet them. They're like different people to them. They spend very little time. So I think we're just more disconnected from the military. We have a military that has suffered in terms of budgets and in terms of numbers of ships and numbers of planes, but we also have a military with the diminution of it that's fighting more kinetic wars than at any recent time. It's everywhere. Our special operation forces are in more than 100 countries. And I think we were surprised with the Niger and Chad, and the fact to find out that we have special operators there and military forces. They are doing all kinds of work around the globe. We're in Iraq, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Syria. There's a big fight in Yemen. The future battleground for the global war on terror is the African continent. That's particularly frightening because there are more than 2,000 languages on the continent, and our U.S. military and intelligence community are probably in command of no more than 200. So there's a lot that we won't understand that's actually going on. We're there in small numbers in some countries and regions, but we're not really able to command the political culture, which is really open to ISIS and its various offshoots, and Al-Qaeda as well. So when I think of all of that, combined with the cultural components I've talked about, I do worry about what it means to use deterrence in the future. And I'm being told that I can be heard better if I move my hair or move it up. They're telling me to do something, move it up a little bit. So I don't think the sky is completely falling because I believe in the resiliency of our system. But I do think there are some fundamental challenges that are more internal than they are external. And I actually think our biggest national security threats are happen to be with who we are and how we're defining ourselves and what our priorities are, than they are the external challenges, which are always going to be there.
So we had a great drawdown after the end of the Cold War, combined with cultural factors, as Kyron has laid out, that prevented us from talking about, learning about deterrence. It recalls one of the quotes in the film that really stuck out to me, that the winners of World War I were more traumatized than the losers. And Claudia, I've often wondered, after we invaded Iraq in 2003, we've had 15 years now of being told that America doesn't win wars, that when we invade is the word used, we then torture people, and then we lose. What effect has that had on the journalism profession, on our politicians, on our military figures, in the way that they think and even discuss or write about deterrence?
Abysmal. That's quite dangerous and abysmal. There are a couple of things going on with this, and I want to just, when you were talking about the drawdown, here's just a really graphic example of how crazy this has gotten. The final month of President Obama's second term, early January, there was a week when America had not a single aircraft carrier operating on the oceans. They were all in for maintenance. That was reported, and I thought that can't be true. It was. Okay. We are the world cop, and what I want to sort of take back to your question on what's been happening. What I see as far as the U.S. power of deterrence, if you work in enough parts of the world, you get sort of angles on how people regard the U.S., and very often it's surprising how much they want to depend on the U.S., even when they say they hate it. One of my favorite cases being in Moscow in the mid-90s, some hardline nationalists who shot a rocket launch grenade at the American embassy, which actually killed nobody. It hit a wall on the other side of a huge Xerox machine and took out the Xerox machine. And they were demonstrating in the street in front of this, and I went to interview one of them, and he said, "Oh, you're American. I love America. I have a brother there." I said, "Then why are you attacking the American embassy?" He said, "It's what we do, but I'd really like to go to America." That's very often the kind of thing that you will hear. Now, I think in the Middle East, it's taken a much darker turn, but they look to the United States, and as we sort of have faded from the scene, I want to bring in the United Nations here. I think one of the big problems is we deferred more and more after the end of the Cold War to the United Nations. Okay, the first big successful operation was going in to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. That was a UN coalition, and part of the problem there was that's why we didn't actually go and remove Saddam. We only went as far as the UN said was okay. We left Saddam in power. All sorts of bad things came out of that. And I don't think this is a place to rehash the whole Iraq war, but if you actually read the Delphi report, which ran to more than 900 pages, not just the press release, Saddam Hussein was getting rid of sanctions through the UN Oil for Food program to reconstitute his WMD programs. It wasn't as if he'd given up the idea. He wasn't a nice guy. There was a real problem there. That sort of went by the board. We were so taken with what you've what Kieran just described as, sort of our cultural discovery. Cold War is over. Don't need to worry about the bomb shelters anymore. Let's go weave baskets. That sort of became, as they say in Washington, the narrative. And the problem is, if you're not going to have the United States as a cop on the world beat, what are you going to have? If you make it the United Nations, the problem is there is no overarching authority there that administers justice. There is no policeman up there that will be fair. Our system works because we elect leaders, and internally they're accountable, and we sort of have this whole discussion going through the ballot box. But at the United Nations, there is no such system. It's a collective. It is Animal Farm, basically. And when you look to that and say, please defend the planet, you will get Animal Farm. You will get the kind of thing we have going on right now, where I'm extremely concerned, speaking of deterrence, with the North Korean situation, because we're going to the UN, and they're doing a great job reporting on sanctions violations and passing sanctions resolutions. Has anyone noticed that this actually has not stopped their nuclear program? We've been doing it for 12 years at the UN. The problem being, in the end, you need something or someone who will act decisively, preferably in a way that advances the cause of freedom, not the cause of, say, Putin's Russia.
Okay, so was the election of Trump, Karen, a vote to rebuild U.S. deterrence, or was it a vote to continue the retreat, the America First isolationist interpretation of Trump?
I actually think it was a vote to reassert deterrence, and that America First is the wrong term. Trump happens to like it, but I don't think he knows its history, which is a little bit odious, not completely, but it was associated with isolationism before the America First Committee, before we entered World War II. It disbanded almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. But it did have an anti-Semitic overtone in some dimensions, and so I think it's probably not the best term, but it's his term. But it's not about isolationism. It's an interest-based theory of international relations, saying that the interest of our nation, which is survival, and the core responsibility of a leader is survival of the political and territorial integrity of his country, and given that, interests have to dominate, and that other nations should do the same. So that's not really America first when he's also exhorting other nations to put their interests first. But I think he does want to reassert deterrence. The problem with deterrence is that it's a strategic interaction game. You aren't deterring by yourself. And you've got to have an adversary or an actor on the other side that also believes in deterrence for it to work. Deterrence is using strength to get to peace, stability, and mutual cooperation, but also often the stronger nation is defining peace, stability, and mutual cooperation around his own values. For example, in the United States, during the final decade of the Cold War, we defined mutual cooperation with the Soviets as we were outspending them militarily. We became deeply involved in a technology arms race with a strategic defense initiative known as Star Wars. We defined mutual cooperation as the Soviet Union joining the community of free states, basically dissolving. And so one of the problems of deterrence is that it does mean on the other side that the stronger nation really compels you to do something in the long run that you do not want to do. That mutual cooperation really isn't mutual cooperation. That's one problem. Another problem with deterrence is that if there's a cultural dimension to it, it's kind of, since the Cold War, become kind of a Western idea, and you need certain attributes, a nation state, a nation that wants to survive. But if you've got transnational actors that don't care about their survival, you can't enter a deterrent game with them. But terrorists and other types of actors, or even rogue state actors. I think one of the interesting features of the Trump 2017 first year is that there was a probing game between the North Korean leader and the American leader about North Korea's commitment to survival. And so we thought that Kim Jong-un was a complete wild man, but he may not be, because we're seeing him in 2018 show some interest in wanting to perhaps negotiate away his nuclear program. That could be rhetoric or not. But I think last year was really probing whether we can enter a deterrence game with the North Korean leader, or is he so risky that he's willing to, press the button and blow himself up in the rest of the world. I don't think that's where he wants to go. If his survival is key, then we've learned a lot about the capacity for deterrence to work.
So we've talked about the trail of U.S. deterrence and its erosion, the politics of the election of Trump and the rebuilding of deterrence. Let's move then to the case studies to North Korea. Claudia, Kyron said that maybe we are finding out more about Kim Jong-un and his capacity for deterrence and his willingness to negotiate. Is Trump deterring North Korea, or does it look like he's appeasing North Korea?
I'm sorry to say, I think right now he's appeasing North Korea. Here's my read is Kim Jong-un is never going to give up his nuclear program. I mean, if they have a summit and Trump's line is, I'm sorry, you're simply not going back home, there's a man in the back who will escort you out of the room, and we have a villa for you in Hawaii vacated by Marcos. That might work. That might be a way to remove him. But as far as a deal, it's just too entrenched in North Korea in how they work. And my read on this, as you see, there's a lot of debate over these things, so you can, good people can see it differently. But is that North Korea has not been persuaded that we will attack them. They think they're safe. because we haven't. We haven't for 70 years, you know, and sorry, the Korean War. They invaded South Korea. We fought back to the DMZ after 3 bloody years, you know, up to the north and down to the south, up to the north. But we have basically sat there since then, and we have nuclear weapons they don't believe we would use. They've been making them, we threaten them, we scold them, we sanction them, but what we haven't done is actually attack them. And I think that that plus the hostage situation with Seoul, where, you know, the fabled guns, the artillery that with conventional weapons has threatened South Korea for years, means that they know that they can do these things and get away with it. Now, the problem is, at some point, they may go too far. They will get an American president who says, no, you can't. And then you really could have a war. On the other hand, can we go back with North Korea for a minute? The missed moments when something might have stopped this trajectory they're now on, where they are really amassing a nuclear arsenal and missiles that can hit this country, and they sell these things. Actually, the point that Neil Ferguson made in the film is really important. Yeah, Americans like to read about themselves, so you always read in the papers that the big danger is it might strike America. If they have the weapons to be able to do that, that is certainly a danger. But there are 2 further problems. One is they sell these things, and you don't know where it could some part of this could finally turn up, the technology, the weapons themselves. The other is that other states see what they get away with. And if North Korea can get away with it, imagine the conclusions that Vladimir Putin draws.
So, Kyra, does that mean that Trump's approach to North Korea is the key to reestablishing U.S. deterrence? That rogue states are watching what he's doing?
I do agree with that point, but I disagree a little bit on the issue of deciding what's going to happen in this experiment. I think we have to run it a bit more before saying that the U.S. has moved into appeasement mode with North Korea. It's not clear to me that that's actually the case, because I think the sanctions have been much more pressing than they've been in the past, and that there is a growing coalition against North Korea that wasn't in place at the start of the Trump administration. You know, ambassadors have been expelled from countries, embassies have been downgraded as a result of the missile tests last year. North Korean workers have been expelled. I think there are a set of activities that we need to take seriously that's really activating a broader coalition in support of the United States in North Korea. So I'd like to, before the saying that discussion of my death is just a little bit premature. Let's see if let's give it some time. But this is a very hard case study. It's the hardest.
Well, I'll throw another one at you, and Kyra, I'll go to you first. Iran. Mm-hmm. President Trump, in a speech last year, very clearly to the nation said we're going to contain Iran, mm-hmm. and we're not going to make the nuclear deal the focus of policy. Mm-hmm. We're going to take a more comprehensive approach. Mm-hmm. Is Trump, who, as we've established, was elected to rebuild U.S. deterrence that has deteriorated so much, mm-hmm. is he deterring Iran?
I think that there is a huge debate within the administration about how to do that, and I don't think that the president has in place the people who believe the way that he does on Iran. That, in fact, all of those campaign statements and his attempts last year to say that he was going to decertify the nuclear deal, he doesn't have, I think, enough fellow travelers to make the compelling case
what do you think he would do? How would he deter Iran?
I think he does not know, and I think that's what he's been waiting for from his team. Every time the certification issue comes up, he's waiting for alternatives, and he receives one, which is Iran is compliant and let's recertify. I don't think that the machinery of the U.S. government and those who are serving in the national security community now really understand what it would mean and how to go about decertifying Iran and getting a more comprehensive deal. I think it's above the pay grade of the national security community because it is a incredibly heavy lift. So I think it's aspirational, and I do agree with much of what he has said on Iran, but I would pick up a prize if I knew how to do it. And I think in order to do what he wants to do with Iran, he really needs stronger, I think, team members on the points that he wants. That doesn't mean that they aren't strong intellectually, but appeasement is so much easier on the Iranian problem. And we, in fact, as you've just said on North Korea, we've been appeasing Iran for a long time too, well before the 2015 agreement. So I think we've been conditioned to think about Iran in those terms. And it may not happen soon that we get a mind shift on Iran beyond the president and a few others.
Just for the audience members who don't follow the ins and outs, I want to distinguish between the nuclear deal and the decertification that Chiron talked about. The two things are separate. The nuclear deal was an agreement between certain parties. The decertification is an issue of a law, rather, that was passed through Congress that forces the president, after a certain period, to certify that Iran is meeting certain conditions, but it's separate and distinct from the deal. So he can decertify without breaking the deal. Claudia.
But he wants to break the deal.
He wants to break the deal.
But the first step is decertifying is really important. But he can barely get there.
He can barely get there. He wants to win, Claudia, winning bigly. Can you deter Iran?
Yes. And here's how I would like to see him do it, bigly. You can deter Iran by bringing down the government of North Korea. How's that for an idea? And because I don't think North Korea can be deterred from its nuclear weapons program. And that gives you the problem that there they are. This has sort of ensured their survival to date. It brings the mighty U.S. to the table with North Korea, the example that the world sees. And it's observed, I think, keenly in Beijing, in Moscow, in Tehran, everywhere, is that you proceed with this. You play this game of chicken in our face. You threaten us in the most horrible ways and our allies, and you'll do all right. And it's become an example where North Korea has been sort of the pioneer of this since the Cold War ended. They've been just spectacular on this front. They're the only country known, unless the Russians have done it and I missed it.
There's probably a Russian here somewhere.
Yes. Anyway, only country known to have tested nuclear weapons in the 21st century, and they've done 6 tests at least. This has been incredibly brazen and out there, and they no longer try and keep it quiet. They brag about it. Hey, there was a hydrogen bomb we just touched off. You know, that's not good. And they threatened to reduce us to darkness and ashes, or Japan, this darkness and ashes. We're seas of fire. And likewise, South Korea. We have a major problem here. I don't think that Kim Jong-un is suicidal. I don't think he's going to just attack the U.S. for the fun of it. But how do you deter a country like that? I don't think you can get an arrangement that is going to work. I think you bring that regime down. Now, how do you do that? I only have one suggestion I'll throw out here to add to what we've been trying to do. I have very little faith in sanctions just because a fair part of my work over the past 20 years has involved tracking down how people violate them. And there's a lot of money to be made in violating them, and people are really clever about it. It's amazing. I can take you on a walking tour of Hong Kong sometime and show you the North Korean fronts, the Iranian fronts, the guy who's now got his shipping front companies that were sanctioned Iranian shipping fronts advertised in front of his office. I stopped by last year, and does business with the North Koreans, etc. It's really hard because they keep a step ahead of us. So I don't have faith in sanctions. Nobody seems keen on a hot war. I'm certainly not. I have a nephew I adore in the Marines. I would hate to lose him in a second Korean War, and I like a lot of South Koreans, although I wish they'd step up to the plate and acknowledge that they have a major problem in North Korea. But North Korea has been messing with our heads for ages. Maybe we're already doing the kind of thing I'm about to suggest. but if we are, I think we could do more of it. Here's just one thought, and then I wish people who do this kind of thing for a living would do a lot more of this sort of thing. We designate North Korean officials, okay? We don't like so-and-so. He's involved in missile deals in Iran and Mozambique or something. Okay, we designate them. Treasury puts them on a specially designated nationals list. They're blacklisted and so on. The problem is most of these people aren't operating in places where we can get to them. They don't have assets in the United States, and they set up newfound companies under their Aunt Park, and that's that. Well, I wouldn't designate them. I would make them rich. I would start setting up, if I ran the show, dummy bank accounts for the most trusted lieutenants around Kim Jong-un, because if you look at how regimes like that are vulnerable, and I don't want to stray too far from deterrence, the economy is a tough one. But the biggest problem Kim Jong-un has, as any dictator does, is knowing who around him to trust. And if you chip away at that, that was the lesson of Saddam. And his biggest problem was how to make sure his own lieutenants were not stealing from him as he violated sanctions. So I would say proceed down that avenue. And the biggest difficulty with that is there's a binary decision at some point. Are you going to try and take him down? Are you going to negotiate with him? If you negotiate with him, you fortify him.
So we clearly have a disagreement.
That's what I would do to
North
deter
Korea
Iran.
On Japan.
Yeah.
Yes. I set North Korea aside. Iran, I set it aside. Let's just, because I don't have that many minutes left before I open it up to the floor when they'll ask better questions. I have to ask about Russia, Kyron. Is Russia deterrable? And if so, how?
Well, I want to say one more thing about North Korea.
Okay.
So before I get on to Russia, I don't think it's just I think these are false binary opposites. Either we negotiate or we can try to take him down. I don't think that we have any possible way to successfully take down the North Korean regime. It's a situation that if you try, you have to succeed, because if you fail, it's worse. On your nation and the region. And so given that we don't have the best intelligence there, and because we haven't had a presence, and we don't have, as you've just said, the strongest ally in South Korea. They're an important ally, but they could do more. We would really be on our own. And we'd have to successfully be able to persuade the military and the North Korean elites who would love to see Kim Jong-un go, that it would be safe for them to participate, because it can't be done without them. This was the problem of Saddam Hussein. We did try to get to those around him. We failed for some of the same reasons. It's extremely difficult. And if you don't make it, you make the adversary stronger.
Oh, I didn't mean bribe them.
I meant
compromise them.
Yeah, but some of it includes you need their support because they want to do it. So it's not even bribing them so much as having them be co-conspirators. I don't see how we would do it otherwise. So I think that that the fact that that's a really difficult thing to do. And I don't know that we've ever been successfully able to do it to our advantage.
I have
Okay.
moderator prerogative because I have one more question.
Okay, Russia.
Because I do want to get to Russia.
Okay.
Because unlike North Korea, which may or may not be deterrable, we clearly have a debate, Russia may be. We have Russia increasingly aggressive. It's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. We just had the use of a nerve agent on British soil.
Yeah.
And perhaps not, well, it certainly wasn't the first time. So, Kyron, are we going to stand up and deter Putin under this president?
I think absolutely so, partly because it's not as difficult as it was during the Cold War. This is not the Soviet Union with the robust Red Army. This is a very different Russia with a massively poor economy and with horrible birth and life statistics. And so I think it's a country that I think is gasping for air and trying to hold on to its great power status. It's a country to take seriously, but it's not our biggest foe in the world. It is doing menacing things in Syria. The prior administration just stood by while it violated the territorial, sovereignty of Ukraine. I don't know that we'll be able to reverse that. The prior administration watched it violate the the first nuclear disarmament agreement, the INF Treaty of the Cold War. It does those things, but it doesn't have the capacity for the massive follow-through.
Okay, fascinating. With that, I'm going to open it up to the floor. In the blue.
My name is Bill, and I have 2 questions. And can I make a statement?
One question, no statements.
Oh, just one question? Okay.
No statements, please.
All right, then I'll try to keep it pithy. Then.
One question.
Okay. How would you feel about appeasing and deterring North Korea by inviting Kim to be a contestant on The Apprentice?
Anyone want to take that? Claudia?
Yeah, just don't let him go home.
I agree with what you said.
Okay, we have agreement on North Korea.
My name is Kimberly Borchert-Bolt. I would like to know, how do you feel about cyber security for both deterrent and appeasement?
Yeah, that's a great question that I don't know if the full documentary takes that up, but that, I mentioned earlier that deterrence really, it's a strategic interaction game. And that means that you're always calculating about what you think the other side is going to do. And so the Cold War was in some ways a perfect scenario because you had two countries dominating the system. Both, were basically embraced, Western values. Marxism, for all of its problems, is a Western ideology. Islam is not. Karl Marx was a German Jew. He would have been 200 this year, so lots of liberal institutions are celebrating the 200 year of his birth. But it was a Western idea that had some core assumptions in common with the values that we hold. What's different in the cyber realm, and then in the transnational realm with actors, terrorists, we don't hold the same values. It's hard to play the deterrence game with them because the values are different and they're often a black box and they aren't a nation state. And so it's hard, it's an asymmetric game where the asymmetry is often to their advantage. In the cyber realm, it gets even more complicated because how do you do cyber deterrence? How do you deter against a whole range of actors, some of which could be lone actors, as Trump likes to say, a 400-pound man in his basement in bed, but it's a very different kind of game, and I think that would be a different conversation to have about deterrence, but it's probably the riskiest of all, because it's a non-kinetic attack often that leads you into a military response that can escalate, and sometimes if you aren't attributing the act to the right actor, then you do something really bad that's irreversible in the world.
Really tough question. There's an old film that comes to mind, and it doesn't solve the problem that Karen just raised of would you be acting in response to something where somebody manipulates you in a way that isn't what you had in mind. But generally, what to do, this whole business of, say, Russia hacking into our political debate, to actually stop this at a technical level is, I think, very difficult at some point. You can do some things, but how do you prevent that? What you need is something where at least as far as officially they are directing anything of this kind, they don't want to do it anymore because, as Neil said in the film, you hit me, I'll hit you back harder. And for that, I'm not sure that that cyber is what's called for. Again, the basic problem we're sort of we end up dancing around is, well, at what point do you take the risk of saying, I'm going to make you believe that I'll hit back harder? Because if I can go back for a minute I think a big problem we have right now is that America ended up, after the previous administration, with very little credibility. The red lines were erased. The strike in Syria was gone. The demand that Assad step down was gone. The demand that North Korea stop was gone. We didn't have any credibility. And the problem is, how do you reestablish that without actually fighting a war, without launching an attack? President Reagan went into Grenada to show the world, in part, you don't mess with us. This is a small example, but you don't mess with us. And that's part of the very hard thing that now needs doing. And I think when President Trump sent 3 aircraft carriers to exercise together near North Korea last winter, in the fall, the problem is it's a great show of force, but there's that gap of, do people believe that we would actually use it? And that over and over is the problem. Otherwise, I don't know that it needs to be perfectly symmetrical to say, you know, you cyber attack us, we'll cyber attack you. Can be, cyber attack comes from your direction, we'll blow up something you really don't like. We'll, that's the problem, is how do you do that without ending up in a large war?
My name is Camelia, and I have a question about sanctions. Obviously, the sanctions that we have implemented on the rogue regimes for the past, 2 decades at least, that I am aware of, are not working. And as very well Claudia has pointed out, these rogue regimes have a way of circumventing these sanctions very masterfully. So my question is about how do you feel about sanctioning the rogue regime's top echelon officials, the leaders, say the military leaders, the government leaders, what do you feel about sanctioning those people's, their accounts? They have massive accounts in all over the world under different company names, different names.
So the question is, Claudia,
what do you feel about sanctioning?
How about sanctioning Putin personally? We still haven't done it yet. Treasury hasn't done it. Congress hasn't done it. Putin has never been sanctioned. Is it time?
Do it if I say my view there is do it if we want to. I don't, but I don't expect it to make any great difference. I mean, it's a statement, but will it stop him from doing things? No, I don't think so. It becomes at a certain point an exercise on paper.
Do you agree?
I'd like to see Putin sanctioned, so I take the opportunity. Yeah. I wouldn't give it up. I think it's a signal, and sometimes sanctions serve as a powerful signal. But even if you're able to stay one step ahead, as you said, of the sanctions, they do increase transaction cost because you are having to do more work. You're having to start front companies, and you do lose. And you do bring along some other states who may not completely comply with the sanctions or who may be irrelevant, but they do other things, like downgrade an embassy. So I wouldn't give up on sanctions if they don't, even though they're not pristine in their effect.
Here's my concern.
Wait, I'm sorry, I'm ending it there because I want to have room for one or 2 more questions. We've got a lot of questions.
My name's Grayson, and the question I wanted to ask was, in light of the resurgence of the Taliban in Afghanistan, Trump approved sending more troops there, but the problem's also getting worse in Pakistan. As you guys probably know, the Taliban is becoming stronger there as well. And I was just wondering if you guys had a take on how we could better prevent a coup occurring in Pakistan, where they do have nuclear technology and an undeterrable enemy like Taliban getting their hands on that.
I don't know that we can prevent a coup in Pakistan, but we can get tougher with Pakistan. And the South Asia strategy of the Trump administration, enunciated last August, I think is far superior, followed by the decision not to provide Pakistan with weapons, is far superior to the AFPAC policy of the Obama administration. And I think one of the surprises of 2017 is that we took on Pakistan. Will we sustain it? And will it hurt it directly? It's moved more toward China as a result? But the fact is that we have very few options with Pakistan but to try to get tough. I don't think we can prevent a coup. I wouldn't know how to do that. But the pathway to Afghanistan for a somewhat stable Kabul government, and I say somewhat, is through Pakistan and its ungoverned territories and its willingness to harbor the Taliban and all kinds of other terrorists as well.
Okay, lightning round.
I first want to thank Claudia for all the work you've done that shows your consistent concern for life and dignity for all those people living in dictatorships as well as authoritarian regimes. So thank you. And with that, I'd like to extend your proposition a bit further.
Lightning round, quickly.
Yes.
Question?
It's that if Trump and Kim Jong-un were to meet, so don't let him go home. And if we do that, what's next?
Very smart people sit down and discuss something. I'm going to throw in this. Here's the thing that is hanging over all of this, because, Mary, if you'll just give me a second, I just want to tell you why this all matters so much. Because we sit and we talk in Washington and New York. We have these debates and discussions, and they're extremely interesting. But they can start to feel academic. And I brought this along. I pulled this off the shelf last night as I was coming down here. It's a book written by a man who became a pilot. And he's writing about the 30s when he was a young man, and his mother wanted him to go study medicine, and he wanted to fly planes, so he joined the Air Force. Neither she nor I gave thought, he writes, to the possibility that I would ever be flying in combat. The year was 1937. War seemed very remote in the mid-30s. The guy who wrote that is named Paul Tibbets. Anybody know who he was? 8 years later, he dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And that's where these things matter. It's all academic until it's not. And it can happen so fast. And that I think, is where the world is right now.
Jacob Rich? Yeah, that's my name. And hey, I had the opportunity to be an intern last semester. Yes, so given the fact that nuclear weapons might be responsible for the lowest violent death rate of our history, and that bad things happen to Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, isn't it completely irrational that Un wants nuclear weapons, and maybe we should just trade with him, given that he can really hurt us? I don't know. Can we
deter North Korea by giving South Korea nukes?
Oh, that's not even.
I think the most dangerous border in the world is not the U.S.-Mexico, the Mexico-Guatemala, but it's India-Pakistan, because they're adversaries and they both have nuclear weapons. Adding more countries with adversarial borders to the nuclear club is not something I'd like to be responsible for.
With the mic.
Mackenzie Wolf. The Trump admin worked to deter the Assad regime by striking their air force over the use of chemical weapons, but since that time there have been 39 uses of chemical weapons in Syria, but we haven't struck them since. Is that deterrence? Why aren't we continuing to deter the Assad regime?
I don't know why we...
yes or no?
Obviously not enough. And I think it's not only striking there, it's where are these coming from, who is behind it, which takes us to North Korea and the Russians.
I think if we strike every time there's some kind of illicit attack in Syria, we'd be striking all the time. But I do agree with your larger point that it's ineffective to pick and choose. But I don't think, again, we know, Secretary Tillerson, before he was deposed, was out at the Hoover Institution in January and gave a talk about Syria. And he committed us to Syria for a generation. We're supposed to basically bring down the government, kick out the Iranians, kick out the Russians, kick out the Turks. And when he finished talking, it was really yet another major conflict, and have boots on the ground. It did not sound like we had figured out a Syria policy, and I think that's what you're speaking to. And that was reflected in his speech.
Okay, my name is David James, and just being real quick, raising it a little bit to the other side of the deterrence is what is war? And has part of it, as we've come out of the end of the Cold War, we've gone away from what is war as a battle of interest. And so that's part of the calculus that we're leaving out. How do we overwhelm the other person's interest to where it's not worth their price to seek their interest?
Name a person. I mean, how do you do it? I think it's very tricky. There's not a recipe, there's not a formula. I think part of what you're describing is trying to figure out in each case, what can you do? We do have examples of things that worked in the end. Something happened with the Soviet Union. There's still a debate over exactly what caused that, but it probably mattered that Ronald Reagan stood up to them, where, for instance, Jimmy Carter did not. It probably mattered that after the defeat in Vietnam and then the Islamic Revolution 4 years later in Iran, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, this country flipped around and elected a president who said, I'm not having that anymore. So, and then it becomes a matter of smart people sitting down and trying to figure out exactly what kind of horse trading can go on. What can
you the last word?
What you've just described is actually the essence of deterrence, and I do think that we can learn from the Reagan years. Military power really does matter, but it matters when it's combined with also very directed diplomacy that shows the adversary that military power is a part of a strategy for a very different goal. And it's not an end in itself. That's really hard for leaders to do. And I think the essence of deterrence comes from leadership and having a consistent message from a very strong leader who's able to defy his own bureaucracy, his advisors, and his adversaries. Do we have that in Donald Trump? Let's see.
Great place to end.
Thank you.
Thank you.